the night above Heavenly Void Peak had no wind. That was the first thing Lin Fan noticed when he opened his eyes inside the highest hall of Heavenly Void Peak. The bronze lamps along the black jade pillars burned with motionless flames. Their light stood straight, thin and cold, as if painted onto the darkness. Outside the open doors, clouds lay beneath the peak like a dead sea, silvered by moonlight, unmoving for 1,000 li. Heavenly Void Peak was never quiet. At this height, the winds should have been sharp enough to split stone. They should have rushed through the ancient pines, struck the hanging bells under the eaves, and dragged white mist across the stairway that led to the throne hall. Even on ordinary nights, the mountain seemed alive beneath the stone. Tonight, it held its breath. Lin Fan remained seated on the obsidian dais, one hand resting on the arm of his throne. His long black robe pooled around him like spilled ink. Strands of pale gold thread were woven into the collar and sleeves, forming patterns of suns, moons, and shattered stars. The robe was not decorative. Each thread was a sealed killing intent taken from a fallen enemy, refined across centuries, and forced to serve him. Once, men had called it magnificent. Lin Fan had never cared for magnificent things. He cared for whether a thing could cut, bind, suppress, deceive, endure, or survive. Beauty was only useful when it made others lower their guard. His fingers tapped once against the throne. The sound should have crossed the hall and returned with 7 echoes. The hall had been built that way, each wall carved from void resonance stone, each pillar placed according to a formation older than most living sections. When an enemy stepped inside, every breath, heartbeat, and twitch of muscle would be caught by the stone and delivered to Lin Fan's divine sense. Tonight, his tap returned with 6 echoes. The 7th was missing. Lin Fan's eyes did not move. The bronze lamps kept burning. The jade floor kept reflecting the moon. Beyond the doors, the 1,000-step stairway descended through empty clouds. No guards stood on either side. No disciples knelt at the base of the peak awaiting orders. No immortal cranes crossed the sky with letters sealed in spirit light. Everything was too clean. A weaker cultivator would have called it peace. Lin Fan lifted his right hand. A thread of sovereign chi rose from his fingertip and curled in the air. It was colorless at first, then deepened into a faint violet as it touched the formation lines hidden inside the hall. One by one, those lines should have answered him. They should have awakened like blades sliding out of sheaths. Only the nearest 12 responded. Beyond them, silence spread through the floor. Someone had touched his formation. Not broken it. Broken was crude. Broken left scars. Broken announced fear. This was more careful. A series of small delays. A breath of obstruction here, a half-beat of stillness there. Enough to make the heavenly void grand array feel whole to anyone who glanced at it, yet hollow enough that when it truly mattered, one layer would fail, then another, then another. Lin Fan looked at the violet thread wrapped around his finger. For a long moment, his expression did not change. The person who had done this knew the rhythm of his formations. The person who had done this had seen him repair them, improve them, and hide a second killing array beneath the first. They knew that Lin Fan trusted no outer formation completely. They knew he always left a blade under the table, a poison in the cup, a shadow behind the light. They also knew which blade he had sharpened last. Lin Fan closed his hand. The sovereign chi vanished. In the darkness beyond the hall, a bell hung from the southern eave. It was no larger than a child's fist, made of old copper, plain and unremarkable. When storms crossed the peak, the bell never rang. When thunder cracked the sky, it remained silent. It rang only when someone with killing intent toward Lin Fan stepped within 10,000 steps of the throne hall. Tonight, the bell was still. That meant either no enemy had entered Heavenly Void Peak, or the enemy had found a way to walk beneath the bell's judgment. Lin Fan's gaze shifted toward it. There were not many people under heaven who could do that. 3, perhaps. 2 of them were dead by his hand. The third had once poured tea for him with lowered eyes and trembling fingers, pretending not to understand the cruelty required to climb above all living beings. Ch01. The name crossed his mind without warmth. It did not wound him. It did not soften him. Names had power only when a man allowed them to. Lin Fan had outlived sects, dynasties, sworn brothers, kneeling enemies, worshipping clans, and women who thought love gave them permission to ask for weakness. Ch01 had been different only because she had lasted longer. He rose from the throne. The hall seemed to grow smaller as he stood. Space bent around him by instinct, lowering itself before the weight of the sovereign realm. The flames inside the bronze lamps tightened. The moonlight on the floor retreated from his feet. Lin Fan descended the obsidian dais one step at a time. His boots made no sound. At the center of the hall, he stopped before a long, narrow crack running through the jade tiles. It had not been there at sunset. The crack was as thin as a strand of hair, hidden beneath the reflection of the moon. Without his divine sense, even an immortal ascension expert would have missed it. He crouched and placed 2 fingers against the floor. Cold. Not the ordinary cold of night jade. This cold carried a faint hunger. It had bitten through the warmth of the formation and settled beneath the tile like a sleeping worm. Lin Fan drew a trace of it into his meridians. The air around him trembled. For an instant, the hall darkened. The cold intent tried to burrow into his flesh, then into his bones, then toward his soul. It was subtle, patient, and vicious. If it had entered the body of another cultivator, it would have hidden for years, feeding on their foundation until one moment of weakness allowed it to bloom. Inside Lin Fan, it survived for less than a breath. His meridians contracted. Sovereign Qi pressed down from all sides. The foreign cold was crushed into a speck of gray light and held between his fingers. Lin Fan studied it. Heavenly slaughter, he said softly. The words did not echo. The missing 7th echo belonged to the same source. Heavenly slaughter formation. An ancient forbidden array created to kill those who had already stepped beyond the common immortal path. It did not rely on power alone. Power could be resisted. It relied on judgment, sacrifice, and shared karmic threads. If enough people connected to the target offered blood, resentment, memory, and fate, the formation could transform the world itself into an execution ground. Lin Fan had destroyed the last known inheritance of that formation 37 years ago. He remembered the cave. The rotten smell of 1,000-year corpse soil. The mad old man nailed to the wall by his own disciples. The jade slip burning with black fire. Lin Fan had read it once, memorized the structure, and then burned the mountain until even the hidden dust in the stone became ash. No one should have known the full pattern. Unless someone had been standing beside him then. Ch01. This time, Lin Fan's eyes lowered slightly. The disciple he had picked up from a blood-soaked battlefield. A child with broken ribs, ruined meridians, and eyes that refused to beg. Lin Fan had seen hatred in that child and recognized a useful material. He had rebuilt Ch01's body, taught him sword intent, fed him pills worth more than kingdoms, and placed enemies in his path like whetstones. Ch01 had never disappointed him. He learned quickly. Killed cleanly. Smiled rarely. Lied better each year. In the end, all disciples wanted one of 2 things from a master. Approval, or the master's corpse. Lin Fan had known that from the beginning. He had simply expected Ch01 to wait longer. The gray speck of cold light trembled between his fingers. Lin Fan closed his hand, and the remnant of the formation intent vanished into nothing. Outside the hall, the moon sank behind a bank of clouds. Darkness entered like water. Lin Fan straightened. His divine sense swept through heavenly void peak without haste. At the eastern cliff, the medicine pavilion stood locked, but all 3 furnace spirits inside were asleep. They never slept on the same night. At the northern pond, the black lotus he had taken from the nether sea had folded its petals inward, hiding from something beneath the water. On the western ridge, the sword marks left by his closed-door cultivation were blurred, as if a veil had been drawn over them. Every place that should have answered him answered half a breath late. Every servant, guard, and disciple below the peak was gone. No bodies. No blood. No struggle. Either they had been removed before the formation began, or they had walked away under orders they believed came from him. Lin Fan reached the threshold of the hall. The night air touched his face, cold and empty. Below, 10,000 stone steps descended into the clouds. Each step was carved with the name of an enemy he had defeated after entering the sovereign realm. Some names belonged to arrogant immortals. Some to ancient demons. Some to sect masters who had smiled during banquets while sharpening knives under the table. The lowest steps had faded with age. The highest ones were still fresh. The topmost step bore a name caught only yesterday. It belonged to an old man who had lived 13,000 years and thought longevity was equal to wisdom. He had kneeled before Lin Fan at noon, forehead pressed to the earth, begging for mercy on behalf of his clan. Lin Fan had granted mercy to the children under 7 and killed the rest. Cruel, the world had whispered. Accurate, Lin Fan had thought. Leave roots, and weeds return. He stood at the edge of the hall and looked past the steps, past the clouds, past the folded mountains. Somewhere far below, countless people were sleeping under roofs built by weaker hands, dreaming of spirit stones, secret manuals, lovers, rivals, revenge, immortality. They looked up at heavenly void peak and imagined the summit was a place of glory. They did not understand that the summit was only another battlefield with fewer witnesses. A faint sound moved through the air. Lin Fan turned his head. The copper bell under the southern eave swayed once. It did not ring. The movement was almost imperceptible, a small tilt of metal in moonless dark. Lin Fan watched it until it stilled again. Someone had crossed the 10,000-step boundary. Someone the bell refused to condemn. Ch01 could do it. Her karmic thread with him was too deep. She had shared cultivation chambers, danger, blood oaths, and silence. She had watched him tear apart enemies who threatened her, and she had watched him tear apart allies who became inconvenient. The bell had accepted her presence long ago. Ch01 could not pass so easily. Unless Lin Fan's own order still protected him. Years ago, after Ch01 survived his first heavenly tribulation, Lin Fan had placed a sovereign seal on the boy's soul. Not as trust. Never trust. A seal could track betrayal, suppress revolt, and crush disobedience. But it also marked Ch01 as belonging to heavenly void peak. The formation would hesitate before striking what carried its master's mark. Lin Fan exhaled once through his nose. Interesting. Not surprising. Not painful. Interesting. The game had begun before the first blade showed itself. He stepped out of the hall. Cloud mist curled around his boots, thin as silk. The entire peak was carved into terraces, bridges, courtyards, and cliffs, all suspended above the sea of clouds. At night, the white stone railings looked like bone. Black pines clung to the slopes, their needles sharp with frost. Spirit lanterns hung along the pathways, but their flames had dimmed to the color of old blood. Lin Fan walked beneath them. Each lantern bowed as he passed. At the first courtyard, he paused before a stone table where an unfinished game of black and white pieces sat untouched. The game had been left there that afternoon. Ch01 had been sitting on the opposite side, sleeve brushing the board, eyes lowered to hide whatever thought she did not wish him to see. She had placed a white piece in the lower right corner. A defensive move. Too defensive. At the time, Lin Fan had ignored it. Not because he missed the sign, but because signs without action were wind. Everyone near him concealed thoughts. Everyone near him weighed fear against desire. If he killed people for thinking of betrayal, there would be no one left in the heavens to pour wine or carry messages. Now he looked at the board again. The white piece in the lower right corner was not part of the game. Its surface held a scratch so shallow that only moonlight could reveal it. Lin Fan lifted the piece between two fingers and turned it. On the underside, a formation mark had been carved with a woman's hairpin. Seal. Delay. Grief. The 3 strokes carried Ch01's aura. Lin Fan's thumb pressed against the piece. It broke without sound. Inside was a drop of dried blood. Not Ch01's. Ch01's. Lin Fan let the fragments fall onto the table. The black pieces nearest to them cracked as if struck by invisible frost. So they had combined their methods. Ch01 provided access. Xianxia provided blood. The Heavenly Slaughter Formation provided the blade. Others were likely waiting beyond the clouds, each offering resentment, fear, or greed. Old enemies. Surviving clans. Righteous hypocrites who called murder justice when performed in groups. Lin Fan almost smiled. Almost. To kill him, they had gathered everything he had taught them to fear. That part was correct. The mistake was believing fear could make them patient enough. He placed his palm over the stone table. Sovereign Qi seeped downward, entered the legs, crossed the courtyard floor, and spread through the hidden veins beneath Heavenly Void Peak. A map appeared in his mind, not as lines but as pressure. Blocked channels. Sleeping nodes. False pulses. Empty guard posts. Silent pavilions. There. Beneath the western ridge, one minor array was still pure. Whoever had prepared tonight had not touched it. Perhaps they had missed it. Perhaps they had judged it unimportant. It was only a weather array used to draw lightning into the sword cliff during storms. Lin Fan had modified it 112 years ago after discovering that lightning attracted certain void-born motes. The motes were useless in battle but sensitive to spatial folds. He had used them for 3 months, learned what he needed, and then allowed the array to decay. Others forgot useless things. Lin Fan did not. He sent a thread of intent toward the western ridge. Nothing happened for 3 breaths. Then, deep inside the mountain, something tiny woke. A thin crackle of blue light flashed across the clouds below. Lin Fan saw the answer immediately. Not with his eyes, but with the motes stirring beneath old stone. Space around Heavenly Void Peak had been folded inward. Not sealed yet. Prepared. Like a net lying loose in water before the hand pulled. If he tried to leave now, the fold would tighten. If he attacked the main formation, the hidden layers would wake. If he remained in the throne hall, the Heavenly Slaughter Formation would finish aligning with the peak's spiritual veins. Every obvious path was a throat waiting for a knife. Lin Fan withdrew his hand from the table. The blue crackle died. For the first time that night, a sound came from the clouds below. Footsteps. One step. Then another. Slow. Measured. Unhurried. The sound climbed the stone stairway beneath the peak, crossing names of the dead. It should have been swallowed by distance, wind, and cloud, but the silence carried it upward with perfect clarity. Lin Fan turned toward the steps. His face remained calm, but the air around him grew heavier. Frost spread across the stone table behind him. The broken game pieces darkened. Farther down the courtyard, a line of blood-red lanterns bent toward the ground until their chains creaked. The footfalls continued. There were 2 sets. One light enough to belong to someone who had once walked beside him through gardens of immortal snow. One steady enough to belong to someone who had learned how to hide terror under discipline. Lin Fan stood alone beneath the blood-colored lanterns, hands behind his back, eyes on the clouded stairway. He did not draw a weapon. The stillness of Heavenly Void Peak pressed down from the sky, from the stones, from the sleeping formations beneath his feet. Somewhere beyond sight, the Heavenly Slaughter Formation gathered its hunger. Somewhere within that hunger, old karmic threads began to tighten around his soul. The copper bell under the southern eave swayed again. This time, it gave a small, cracked sound. Not a warning. An apology. Lin Fan listened to it fade. Then the first figure appeared below the courtyard, rising from the sea of clouds in a robe as pale as winter moonlight. A breath later, the second stepped into view behind her, black sword on his back, eyes lowered like an obedient disciple returning to greet his master. The night remained without wind. Lin Fan looked down at them from the terrace and spoke before either could bow. "You are early."